Clarice Starling was in the middle of a brisk morning run when her beeper went off. The shrill, insistent sound cut through the crisp Virginia air, pulling her from her focused stride. She slowed to a jog, then to a walk, before coming to a full stop. Breathing heavily, she wiped the sweat from her brow and glanced at the message. It was from Jack Crawford, head of the FBI's Behavioral Science Unit. The message was short but clear: report to my office. Urgent. With a sense of foreboding, Clarice hurried back to her dormitory at the FBI Academy in Quantico. She quickly showered and changed into her standard trainee attire, a dark suit, white blouse, and sensible shoes. Her auburn hair was neatly tied back, and her green eyes reflected both curiosity and determination. She had always been a diligent student, driven by a desire to prove herself in the male-dominated world of law enforcement. The walk to Crawford's office was brisk. Quantico buzzed with activity as trainees moved between classes and training exercises. Clarice couldn't help but notice the weight of the stares that followed her, a young woman making her way in a tough, demanding environment. She squared her shoulders and walked faster, determined to meet whatever challenge lay ahead. Crawford's office was located in a secluded wing of the main building. The walls were adorned with framed photographs and certificates, a testament to his long and distinguished career. Clarice knocked firmly on the door and waited for the call to enter. "Come in," came Crawford's voice from inside. She opened the door and stepped into the office, greeted by the sight of Crawford sitting behind his cluttered desk. He was a tall, lean man in his early 50s, with thinning gray hair and piercing blue eyes. Despite the lines of fatigue etched into his face, he exuded an air of authority and confidence. "Agent Starling, please have a seat," Crawford said, gesturing to a chair across from him. Clarice sat down, her back straight and her hands clasped in her lap. She had been in Crawford's office before, but this time felt different. The air was thick with an unspoken urgency. "Thank you for coming on such short notice," Crawford began. "I have an assignment for you. It's both highly sensitive and extremely dangerous." Clarice's heart quickened. "I'm ready, sir," she replied, her voice steady. Crawford nodded approvingly. "I believe you are. That's why I chose you for this task. We need to gather information on a serial killer known as Buffalo Bill. His real name is James Gum. He's abducting and murdering young women. The situation has escalated with the recent abduction of Catherine Martin, the daughter of a U.S. senator." He paused, allowing the gravity of his words to sink in. Clarice felt a chill run down her spine. The name Buffalo Bill was already infamous, whispered among trainees and agents alike. The details were gruesome, but the reality was even more horrifying. "We have a lead," Crawford continued. "A potential key to catching Buffalo Bill. But it's not straightforward. We need insights from another serial killer, Dr. Hannibal Lecter. He was a brilliant psychiatrist before he was incarcerated for multiple murders and acts of cannibalism. He's currently being held at the Baltimore State Hospital for the criminally insane." Clarice's eyes widened slightly. She had heard of Lecter, of course. His crimes were the stuff of nightmares, and his intellect was legendary. Engaging with such a man would be no ordinary interview. it would be a psychological duel. Your task, Clarice, is to visit Dr. Lecter and see if you can draw him out, Crawford said, leaning forward. He has refused to cooperate with us, but we believe he might respond to someone like you. You're young, intelligent, and not yet jaded by the system. Approach him with respect and caution. Use your training, but also trust your instincts. Clarice nodded, absorbing the instructions. I understand, sir. When do I leave? Immediately, Crawford replied. Time is of the essence. I'll provide you with the case files on Buffalo Bill and Lecter. Study them on the way. And remember, Clarice, this is more than just a test of your abilities. Lives are at stake. With that, the meeting was concluded. Clarice stood, shook Crawford's hand, and left the office with a mixture of excitement and trepidation. She retrieved the files and headed to her dormitory to pack a few essentials. As she read through the gruesome details of Buffalo Bill's killings and the clinical descriptions of Lecter's monstrous acts, she felt a sense of resolve harden within her. This was her chance to prove herself, to make a real difference. But it was also a journey into the heart of darkness, where the line between good and evil was perilously thin. Clarice knew that to succeed, she would need to confront not only the monsters she hunted, but also the demons within her own soul. With her bag packed and her mind focused, Clarice Starling set out on the mission that would define her career and change her life forever. The road ahead was fraught with danger and uncertainty, but she was ready to face it head-on. The silence of the lambs awaited her. The drive to the Baltimore State Hospital for the criminally insane was long and somber. Clarice Starling used the time to pore over the case files, committing every detail to memory. The more she read about Buffalo Bill's horrific crimes, the more determined she became to see justice done. Equally important was understanding Dr. Hannibal Lecter, whose brilliant mind and chilling deeds made him a figure of both fascination and terror. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over the landscape, Clarice arrived at the imposing gates of the hospital. The building loomed ahead, a fortress of despair and confinement. After passing through a series of stringent security checks, she was escorted by a guard to the wing where Lecter was held. The corridors were stark and sterile, their cold, clinical atmosphere amplified by the distant, echoing screams of the other inmates. Dr. Frederick Chilton, the hospital's chief administrator, was waiting for her. A vain and self-important man, Chilton greeted Clarice with a condescending smile. "Welcome, Agent Starling. I'm Dr. Chilton. I understand you're here to see Dr. Lecter." "Yes, thank you," Clarice replied, maintaining her composure. She had heard about Chilton's reputation for arrogance and inefficiency, but she was determined not to let him rattle her. "Right this way," Chilton said, leading her down another corridor. "Dr. Lecter is a unique case, as I'm sure you're aware. He has a knack for getting inside people's heads. I hope you're prepared for that." Clarice nodded, not trusting herself to speak. She was acutely aware of the gravity of the situation and the need to remain focused. As they approached the high-security wing, the air grew colder, and the sense of unease deepened. They stopped in front of a heavy steel door. Chilton entered a code on the keypad, and the door slid open with a loud clang. This is where I leave you, Agent Starling. You'll be monitored at all times. If you need assistance, just signal the guard. Thank you, Dr. Chilton, Clarice said, stepping through the door. It closed behind her with a final, ominous thud. The cell block was dimly lit, with a series of barred cells lining both sides of the narrow corridor. Each cell contained a solitary figure, some muttering to themselves, others staring vacantly into space. At the far end was the cell that housed Dr. Hannibal Lecter. As Clarice approached, she saw him standing in the center of his cell, waiting for her. He was a tall, lean man in his late 40s, with sharp features and penetrating eyes. His gaze was calm and unblinking, and a slight smile played at the corners of his mouth. He wore a plain white jumpsuit, and his hands were clasped behind his back. "Good evening, Dr. Lecter," Clarice said, stopping a few feet from the bars. "Good evening, Clarice," Lecter replied, his voice smooth and cultured. "I've been expecting you." Clarice felt a shiver run down her spine. She had been warned about Lecter's ability to unsettle people, but experiencing it firsthand was something else entirely. She took a deep breath and composed herself. "I appreciate you taking the time to speak with me, Dr. Lecter." Lecter inclined his head slightly. "The pleasure is mine. It's not often I have such stimulating company. To what do I owe this visit?" Clarice chose her words carefully. "I need your help, Dr. Lecter. There's a serial killer out there, known as Buffalo Bill. He's abducting and murdering young women. We believe you might have some insight into his behavior." Lecter studied her for a moment, his eyes boring into hers. "Buffalo Bill," he mused. "Such an interesting case. And what makes you think I would be willing to help you, Clarice?" Clarice had anticipated this question. "Because you understand the mind of a killer better than anyone. And because you know that helping us could offer you some advantages." A flicker of amusement crossed Lecter's face. "Ah, the carrot and the stick approach. Very clever, Clarice. But let's not pretend that this is simply about catching another killer. You have a personal stake in this, don't you?" Clarice felt a lump form in her throat but forced herself to remain steady. "I'm committed to bringing Buffalo Bill to justice. Just as you once were committed to understanding the minds of your patients." Lecter nodded thoughtfully. "Very well. I'll consider your request. But first, a quid pro quo. I'll give you a piece of information, and in return, you'll tell me something about yourself. A fair exchange, wouldn't you agree?" Clarice hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "Agreed. What would you like to know?" Lecter smiled, a predatory glint in his eyes. "Tell me about the lambs, Clarice. The ones that still scream." Clarice's heart skipped a beat. How did he know? She felt the memories rushing back, the images of the terrified lambs on her uncle's farm. She had tried so hard to forget, to bury those memories deep within her. But now, confronted by Lecter's probing gaze, she knew she couldn't hide. "It was a long time ago," she began, her voice trembling slightly. "I was a child, living on my uncle's farm in Montana. One night, I heard the lambs screaming. They were being slaughtered. I tried to save them, but I couldn't. The sound of their screams, it haunts me. Lecter listened intently, his expression unreadable. When she finished, he nodded. Thank you, Clarice. You've given me something to think about. Now, as promised, a piece of information. Buffalo Bill is not a true transvestite. He only thinks he is because he hates his own identity. Clarice absorbed the information, knowing that even this small insight could be crucial. Thank you, Dr. Lecter. I appreciate your cooperation. Lecter smiled again, a chilling, knowing smile. Remember, Clarice, we are not so different, you and I. We both seek to silence the lambs, in our own way. With that, Clarice stepped back from the bars, her mind racing with the implications of their conversation. She signaled the guard, who escorted her out of the cell block and back into the relative safety of the main building. Dr. Chilton was waiting for her, his expression curious and slightly smug. How did it go? He asked. Clarice managed a tight smile. Productive, Dr. Chilton. Thank you for your assistance. As she left the hospital and drove back to Quantico, Clarice couldn't shake the feeling that she had just scratched the surface of something far deeper and more sinister. The lambs were still screaming, but now she had a glimmer of hope that she might finally be able to silence them. The battle with Buffalo Bill had begun, and she was determined to see it through to the end. Back at Quantico, Clarice plunged herself into the investigation with renewed vigor. The insights from Dr. Lecter provided a fresh perspective, but they also raised more questions. She spent hours analyzing the case files, looking for patterns and connections that might have been missed. The more she learned about Buffalo Bill, the more complex and disturbing the case became. Buffalo Bill, or James Gum, was a meticulous and methodical killer. His victims were all young women, each abducted and held captive for several days before being brutally murdered. The post-mortem examinations revealed that he had removed large sections of their skin, a horrifying detail that suggested a deep-seated psychosis. But what drove him? What was the connection between his crimes and his identity issues? Clarice decided to visit the latest crime scene, hoping to gain further insights. The victim, Rebecca Myers, had been found in a river, her body mutilated and her skin partially flayed. The scene was chaotic, with local law enforcement and FBI agents working together to piece together the evidence. Clarice's arrival was met with a mix of respect and skepticism. As a trainee, she still had to prove herself, and this high-profile case was the ultimate test. The crime scene was a small, secluded area by the riverbank. Yellow police tape cordoned off the area, and the ground was littered with evidence markers. Clarice donned gloves and a protective suit before approaching the body. The sight was gruesome, but she steeled herself, focusing on the task at hand. "Agent Starling," said a voice behind her. She turned to see Agent Burke, one of the senior investigators. "We've been waiting for you. The locals have been combing the area, but so far, nothing definitive." "Thank you, Agent Burke," Clarice replied. "Let's take another look." She crouched beside the body, examining the wounds and the placement of the cuts. The precision suggested a certain level of medical knowledge, but it was also clear that the killer was driven by more than just a desire to kill. There was a ritualistic element to the mutilation, a compulsion that spoke to deeper psychological issues. Clarice stood up and scanned the surrounding area. "Have you found any personal items? Anything that might have belonged to the victim?" "Just her clothes, about 50 yards upstream," Burke replied. "We didn't find her purse or any identification. Whoever did this knew what they were doing." Clarice nodded. "We need to dig deeper into Rebecca's background. There might be a connection we're missing." Clarice's mind was racing as she processed the crime scene. She knew that every detail could be a potential clue. The way Buffalo Bill meticulously skinned his victims indicated a specific pathology. He was trying to transform himself, to create a new identity out of the skins of his victims. This was more than just a series of murders, it was a quest for metamorphosis. She spent the next few hours talking to the local police, gathering information about Rebecca Myers. Her life, her habits, her friends and family, everything could potentially lead to a breakthrough. Rebecca was a college student, well-liked and with no known enemies. She was last seen leaving her part-time job at a local coffee shop. The abduction must have been swift and silent. Back at Quantico, Clarice sat down with her mentor, Jack Crawford, to discuss her findings. Crawford was supportive but also aware of the immense pressure they were under. Catherine Martin's life hung in the balance, and every passing hour made the situation more desperate. "We need to understand Gum's pathology," Clarice said. "Lecter mentioned that Buffalo Bill isn't a true transvestite, that he only thinks he is because he hates his own identity. We need to dig into his background, his childhood, his family. There has to be something there that explains his transformation." Crawford nodded. "I agree. We've been looking into his past, but it's a tangled web. We know he was born Jane Gum and had a troubled upbringing, abused, neglected. His mother was an alcoholic, and he spent time in foster care. But it's difficult to piece together a complete picture." Clarice leaned forward, her eyes intense. "We need to talk to people who knew him, who interacted with him. Foster parents, social workers, anyone who might have insight into his early years. And we need to get Lecter to open up more. He knows something, I'm sure of it." Crawford sighed. "Lecter is a tough nut to crack. He's enjoying this game, and he's not going to give up information easily. But you're right. We need to keep pushing him." Clarice nodded, determination etched on her face. "I'll go back to him. I think I can get through to him if I give him what he wants, pieces of myself, my past. It's a dangerous game, but it's the only way." The next day, Clarice found herself once again standing outside Hannibal Lecter's cell. She took a deep breath and walked in, trying to maintain her composure. Lecter was sitting on his cot, reading a book. He looked up and smiled as she approached. "Clarice," he said, his voice smooth and cultured. "Back so soon? I must say, I find your persistence intriguing." "I need your help, Dr. Lecter," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "You understand Buffalo Bill better than anyone. We need to find him before he kills again." Lecter closed his book and stood up, walking slowly to the bars. And what will you offer me in return, Clarice? Another piece of your past. Another secret to add to my collection. Clarice swallowed hard. Yes, if that's what it takes. Tell me what you need to know. Lecter studied her for a long moment, his eyes gleaming with interest. Very well. Tell me about your father, Clarice. Tell me about his death and how it affected you. Clarice felt a lump form in her throat. She had never talked about her father's death with anyone, not even her closest friends. But she knew that if she wanted to get through to Lecter, she had to be honest, to lay herself bare. My father was a sheriff, she began, her voice trembling slightly. He was killed in the line of duty when I was just a child. It was a robbery gone wrong. He tried to stop the criminals, and they shot him. I was devastated. I felt like my whole world had fallen apart. Lecter listened intently, his eyes never leaving her face. And how did that shape you, Clarice? How did it make you who you are today? Clarice took a deep breath. It made me determined to seek justice, to protect others from experiencing the same kind of loss. It's why I joined the FBI, why I work so hard. I want to make a difference, to honor my father's memory. Lecter nodded slowly, as if absorbing every word. Thank you for sharing that, Clarice. I can see now why you're so driven. Very well, I'll give you something in return. Jane Gum was not born a monster. He was made into one. His transformation began long before he started killing. Look into his time in foster care, the people who influenced him. There you will find the seeds of his pathology. Clarice felt a surge of hope. Thank you, Dr. Lecter. I appreciate your help. Lecter smiled again, that same chilling smile. Remember, Clarice, the answers you seek are often buried in the past. Dig deep enough, and you'll find the truth. With that, Clarice left the cell, her mind racing with new possibilities. She now had a lead, a direction to pursue. She would delve into Jane Gum's past, uncover the influences that had shaped him, and hopefully find a way to stop him before it was too late. Clarice wasted no time in following Lecter's advice. Back at Quantico, she requested all available records on Jane Gum's time in foster care. The files were extensive, detailing a troubled and turbulent childhood. Gum had been moved from one foster home to another, each placement a new chapter in a story of neglect and abuse. She spent hours poring over the documents, looking for patterns, for connections that might explain his transformation into Buffalo Bill. One name kept appearing in the files, Lila Morgan, a social worker who had been assigned to Gum's case during his teenage years. Lila had documented numerous incidents of abuse and had made several attempts to get him into a more stable environment, but her efforts had been in vain. Clarice decided to track down Lila Morgan, hoping that she might provide some insight into Gum's formative years. A quick search revealed that Lila had retired and was living in a small town in Pennsylvania. Clarice made arrangements to visit her the next day. The drive to Lila Morgan's house was long, giving Clarice plenty of time to think. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was getting closer to understanding Buffalo Bill, but there was still so much she didn't know. She was determined to find the missing pieces of the puzzle. Lila Morgan's house was a modest, well-kept home on a quiet street. Clarice parked her car and walked up to the front door, her heart pounding. She rang the doorbell and waited. After a few moments, the door opened, and an elderly woman with kind eyes and a warm smile stood before her. "Miss Morgan?" Clarice asked. "Yes, that's me. How can I help you?" "My name is Clarice Starling. I'm with the FBI. I'm investigating a case involving James Gum, and I was hoping you could provide some information about his time in foster care." Lila's expression softened, and she stepped aside to let Clarice in. "Of course. Come in, dear. I remember James well. He was one of my most challenging cases." They sat down in the living room, and Lila began to recount her experiences with James Gum. He was a troubled boy, always getting into fights, always angry. But there was more to it than that. He was deeply hurt, deeply scarred by the things he had experienced. I tried to help him, but there was only so much I could do. Clarice listened intently, taking notes. "Did he ever talk about his family, about his childhood?" Lila nodded. "Yes, he talked about his mother a lot. She was an alcoholic, and she abused him terribly. He told me that he felt worthless, that he would never be loved. It broke my heart to hear him say that." "Did he ever show any signs of the behaviors that later became part of his crimes?" Clarice asked. Lila sighed. "There were signs, yes. He was fascinated with skin, with transformation. He would talk about wanting to be someone else, about changing his identity. I tried to get him into therapy, but he refused. He was so angry, so full of rage." Clarice felt a chill run down her spine. Lecter had been right. Gum's pathology had deep roots, stretching back to his childhood. She thanked Lila for her time and left, her mind racing with new insights. She now had a clearer picture of James Gum, but there was still more to uncover. Back at Quantico, Clarice compiled her findings and presented them to Crawford. "We're getting closer," she said. "Gum's obsession with transformation, with skin, it all stems from his childhood trauma. We need to look into his connections, the people he interacted with, anyone who might have influenced him." Crawford nodded. "Good work, Clarice. Keep digging. We're running out of time, but I believe you're on the right track." As Clarice continued her investigation, she felt the pieces of the puzzle starting to fall into place. She was determined to find Buffalo Bill and save Catherine Martin, but she knew that to do so, she would have to delve even deeper into the darkness of the human psyche. The journey was far from over, but she was ready to face whatever came next. The investigation into Buffalo Bill was reaching a critical point. With each passing day, the urgency to find and rescue Catherine Martin grew. Clarice Starling worked tirelessly, following every lead, examining every piece of evidence. The insights gained from Hannibal Lecter and Lila Morgan had provided valuable context, but there was still a long way to go. Clarice and the team at Quantico were poring over the files, trying to piece together Gum's movements and associations. They identified several individuals from his past, including former foster parents, social workers, and acquaintances. One name that stood out was Benjamin Raspail, a former patient of Dr. Lecter who had been murdered. Raspail had known Gum, and it was possible that their relationship held crucial clues. Clarice decided to visit Raspail's former residence, hoping to uncover any leads that might have been overlooked. The house was in a quiet, upscale neighborhood, a stark contrast to the grim reality of Gum's life. As she walked through the house, she looked for anything that might connect Raspail to Gum. In the basement, she found a collection of old photographs and personal items. Among them was a photo album containing pictures of Raspail with a younger man who fit Gum's description. The photos showed them together at various locations, suggesting a close relationship. Clarice also found letters and notes, some of which hinted at a shared obsession with transformation and identity. She took the evidence back to Quantico, where it was analyzed in detail. The letters revealed a correspondence between Raspail and Gum, discussing their shared interest in creating new identities. It became clear that Raspail had been a mentor of sorts to Gum, encouraging his delusions and feeding his obsession. With this new information, the team was able to narrow down Gum's possible locations. They identified several properties linked to Raspail that Gum might be using as hideouts. Clarice and a team of agents set out to investigate these locations, hoping to find Catherine Martin before it was too late. The first few properties yielded nothing, but at the fourth location, they found a lead. It was an old, abandoned house on the outskirts of town. The house was in disrepair, with broken windows and overgrown weeds. As they approached, they noticed signs of recent activity, footprints, discarded items, and a faint light coming from the basement. Clarice and the team entered the house cautiously, weapons drawn. The air was thick with tension as they made their way through the dark, dusty rooms. In the basement, they found a makeshift workshop, filled with tools and materials for skinning and sewing. It was a chilling sight, confirming that they were on the right track. As they searched the basement, they found a hidden door leading to a small, dark room. Inside, they found Catherine Martin, alive but terrified. She was chained to the wall, her eyes wide with fear. Clarice quickly freed her, reassuring her that she was safe now. "Thank you," Catherine whispered, tears streaming down her face. "I thought I was going to die here." Clarice hugged her tightly. "You're safe now. We're going to get you out of here." As they escorted Catherine out of the house, Clarice felt a surge of relief. They had found her in time. But the hunt for Buffalo Bill was not over. Gum was still out there, and he would not stop until he was caught. With Catherine Martin safe, the focus now shifted to capturing Jane Gum. Clarice knew that Gum would be desperate, possibly more dangerous than ever. He had lost his latest victim and would likely be looking for another. The team intensified their efforts, analyzing every piece of evidence. Following every lead, they discovered that Gum had been using several aliases and had multiple properties across the country. One property in particular stood out, a secluded house in the countryside, far from any major city. The team believed this to be Gum's primary hideout, where he conducted his gruesome work. Clarice and the team prepared for the raid, knowing that this could be their best chance to catch him. The house was surrounded by dense woods, making it difficult to approach without being detected. They decided to move in under the cover of night, hoping to catch Gum off guard. As they approached the house, Clarice felt her heart pounding in her chest. She knew that this was the moment they had been working towards, the culmination of their efforts. She took a deep breath and steadied herself, focusing on the task at hand. The team moved in silently, surrounding the house. Clarice and a few agents entered through the front door, while others covered the exits. The house was dark and silent, the air heavy with tension. They moved through the rooms methodically, checking every corner, every hiding place. In the basement, they found Gum's workshop, filled with the tools of his gruesome trade. The sight was horrifying, but Clarice pushed through her fear, determined to find him. They moved deeper into the basement, where they found a hidden door leading to a tunnel. Clarice led the way, her flashlight cutting through the darkness. The tunnel was narrow and claustrophobic, but she pressed on, driven by the need to catch Gum. At the end of the tunnel, they found another door. Clarice signaled to the team, and they prepared to breach it. With a loud crash, they burst through the door, entering a large, dimly lit room. Gum was there, standing in the center of the room, holding a knife. His eyes were wild, filled with a mix of fear and rage. "Drop the knife, Gum!" Clarice shouted, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. Gum hesitated, his eyes flicking between Clarice and the other agents. For a moment, it looked like he might surrender. But then, with a roar of fury, he lunged at Clarice, the knife gleaming in the dim light. Time seemed to slow down as Clarice reacted, firing her weapon. The shot rang out, echoing through the room. Gum fell to the ground, clutching his chest. The knife clattered to the floor, and he lay there, gasping for breath. Clarice approached cautiously, her gun still trained on him. She knelt down beside him, watching as the life slowly drained from his eyes. "It's over," she said softly. "It's over." Gum's eyes flickered one last time, and then he was gone. Clarice felt a wave of relief wash over her. They had finally caught him. The nightmare was over. With Buffalo Bill dead and Catherine Martin safe, the case that had consumed Clarice Starling for so long was finally over. The sense of relief was palpable, but so was the weight of everything she had experienced. She knew that the horrors she had witnessed would stay with her forever. Back at Quantico, Clarice was hailed as a hero. Her determination and bravery had been instrumental in solving the case. But despite the accolades, she found it hard to celebrate. The images of the victims, the brutality of Gum's crimes, and the chilling conversations with Hannibal Lecter haunted her. She spent hours in debriefings, going over every detail of the investigation. Crawford was supportive, but he also knew that Clarice needed time to process everything. He encouraged her to take some time off, to rest and recover. Clarice took his advice, returning to her family's farm in Montana. The familiar surroundings provided a sense of comfort and peace. She spent her days walking through the fields, reconnecting with the land and the animals she had always loved. But even in this peaceful setting, the memories of the case lingered. Clarice knew that she needed to confront them, to understand how they had changed her. She spent long hours reflecting, writing in her journal, and talking with friends and family. One evening, as she sat on the porch watching the sunset, she thought about her father. She felt a deep sense of connection to him, knowing that he would have been proud of her. She had honored his memory by seeking justice, by protecting others from harm. As the days passed, Clarice began to feel a sense of closure. She knew that the nightmares might never completely go away, but she also knew that she had the strength to face them. She had survived, and she had made a difference. When she returned to Quantico, she was greeted with warmth and respect. Her colleagues recognized the sacrifices she had made, the bravery she had shown. Clarice was ready to continue her work, to take on new challenges and new cases. She knew that the road ahead would not be easy. There would always be new threats, new horrors to confront. But she was prepared. She had faced the darkness and emerged stronger. And she was ready to keep fighting, to keep seeking justice. Life at Quantico returned to a semblance of normalcy, but the shadow of Hannibal Lecter loomed large. Clarice knew that he was still out there, somewhere, and that his mind was as dangerous as ever. His escape from custody was a constant reminder of the unfinished business between them. One evening, as Clarice was reviewing case files, she received a call from Crawford. "Clarice, we need to talk. There's been a development regarding Lecter." Clarice's heart skipped a beat. "What happened?" "Lecter has been spotted. We believe he's on the move, heading south. We need to track him down before he disappears again." Clarice felt a mix of fear and determination. "I'm on my way." She joined Crawford and a team of agents in the operations center, where they reviewed the latest intelligence on Lecter's whereabouts. He had been seen in a small town in Georgia, but his exact location was unknown. "We have to move quickly," Crawford said. "Lecter is highly intelligent and extremely dangerous. We can't afford to let him slip through our fingers again." The team mobilized, heading to Georgia to set up a perimeter and begin the search. Clarice felt a sense of urgency, knowing that capturing Lecter was a race against time. As they combed through the town, interviewing witnesses and following leads, Clarice couldn't shake the feeling that Lecter was watching them, playing a game of cat and mouse. She knew that he enjoyed the thrill of the chase, the challenge of outwitting his pursuers. Days turned into weeks, and the search intensified. They followed every lead, but Lecter remained elusive. Clarice felt the pressure mounting, the frustration of knowing that he was always one step ahead. One night, as Clarice sat in her hotel room, she received a call from an unknown number. She answered cautiously, her heart pounding. "Good evening, Clarice," a familiar voice said. "I see you're still on the hunt." "Lecter," she said, her voice steadied despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. "Where are you?" "Ah, Clarice, always so direct. I must say, I've missed our conversations. But I'm afraid our time together is coming to an end. I have plans, and you have your own path to follow." Clarice felt a mix of fear and anger. "You won't get away, Lecter. We'll find you." Lecter chuckled softly. "I look forward to seeing you try, Clarice. Until we meet again." The line went dead, and Clarice felt a chill run down her spine. She knew that Lecter was playing a dangerous game, one that could cost her dearly. But she also knew that she couldn't give up. The hunt for Hannibal Lecter would continue, and she would stop at nothing to bring him to justice. As the search for Hannibal Lecter continued, Clarice found herself reflecting on the journey that had brought her to this point. She had faced unimaginable horrors, confronted her deepest fears, and emerged stronger for it. But she also knew that her work was far from over. Back at Quantico, she immersed herself in new cases, using her skills and experience to solve crimes and bring justice to victims. She worked closely with her colleagues, building a sense of camaraderie and trust. The bond they shared was a source of strength, helping them navigate the challenges of their work. Clarice also took time to mentor new agents, sharing her knowledge and insights. She found fulfillment in helping others grow, in seeing them develop their own skills and confidence. It was a way of honoring the support and guidance she had received from Crawford and others. As the months passed, Clarice felt a sense of renewal. She had come through the darkness and found a new sense of purpose. The hunt for Lecter continued, but she no longer felt consumed by it. She had found a balance, a way to move forward while still seeking justice. One evening, as she sat in her office, Clarice received a call from Crawford. "Clarice, we have a lead on Lecter. We think we know where he is." Her heart quickened. "Where?" "He's been spotted in Europe. We're coordinating with international agencies to track him down. I need you to lead the team." Clarice felt a surge of determination. "I'm ready." As she prepared to leave for Europe, Clarice felt a sense of resolve. The journey ahead would be challenging, but she was ready to face it. She knew that capturing Hannibal Lecter was more than just a mission, it was a personal quest, a test of her strength and resilience. As she boarded the plane, she looked out at the horizon, feeling a sense of anticipation. The hunt for Lecter would take her to new places, new challenges. But she was ready. She had faced the darkness and emerged stronger. And she knew that, no matter what lay ahead, she would continue to seek justice, to protect those who could not protect themselves. The journey was far from over, but Clarice Starling was ready to face whatever came next. The hunt for Hannibal Lecter would continue, and she would stop at nothing to bring him to justice. The plane ride to Europe gave Clarice plenty of time to think. She felt a strange mix of anticipation and dread as she crossed the Atlantic. Capturing Hannibal Lecter had always been a consuming pursuit, but now it felt more personal than ever. This wasn't just about justice anymore, it was about closure. Upon landing in Paris, Clarice and her team were briefed by local law enforcement and Interpol agents. Lecter had been spotted in several locations across Europe, including France, Italy, and Germany. His movements were erratic, suggesting that he was both evading capture and perhaps taunting those on his trail. Clarice knew that Lecter was a master of disguise and deception. His ability to blend in, to assume new identities, made him exceptionally difficult to track. But she also knew that he had a penchant for the extravagant and the intellectual. These traits could be used to narrow down their search. The team set up a command center in Paris, utilizing the latest technology and intelligence to coordinate their efforts. Clarice worked closely with agents from different countries, sharing information and strategies. The collaboration was intense and demanding, but Clarice thrived under the pressure. She knew that every moment counted. Days turned into weeks as the search for Lecter continued. They followed leads, conducted surveillance, and interviewed witnesses. The process was painstaking and often frustrating, but Clarice's determination never wavered. She knew that they were getting closer. One evening, as Clarice reviewed the latest intelligence reports, she received a call from an agent in Italy. We have a credible lead. Lecter was spotted in Florence. He's been frequenting an opera house and has been seen in the company of a woman who matches the description of a known associate. Clarice felt a surge of hope. Florence was a city steeped in history and culture, a place that would undoubtedly appeal to Lecter's refined tastes. She immediately arranged for the team to travel to Italy, knowing that this could be the breakthrough they had been waiting for. Florence was as beautiful and enigmatic as Clarice remembered. The city's narrow, winding streets and historic buildings provided the perfect backdrop for a game of cat and mouse. Clarice and her team set up a temporary base of operations, coordinating with Italian law enforcement to track Lecter's movements. The opera house was their primary focus. Lecter's love for music and art was well documented, and the performances at the Teatro della Pergola were world-renowned. Clarice and her team attended several operas, hoping to catch a glimpse of Lecter. They knew that he would be cautious, but they also knew that his ego would draw him to such a prestigious venue. During one such performance, Clarice spotted a man who fit Lecter's description. He was elegantly dressed, blending in with the sophisticated crowd. He sat alone, his eyes focused on the stage. Clarice's heart raced as she signaled to her team, knowing that they had to act quickly but carefully. As the performance ended, Lecter rose from his seat and made his way toward the exit. Clarice and her team followed at a discreet distance, watching his every move. They trailed him through the winding streets of Florence, the tension mounting with each step. Lecter led them to a secluded part of the city, an area known for its historic villas and gardens. Clarice felt a surge of adrenaline as they closed in on their target. She signaled for her team to spread out, ready to intercept him. Lecter turned a corner, and for a moment, he was out of sight. Clarice quickened her pace, her eyes scanning the surroundings. When she rounded the corner, she saw Lecter standing calmly, as if waiting for her. He smiled, that same chilling smile that had haunted her for so long. "Good evening, Clarice," he said, his voice smooth and composed. "I must say, you've been quite persistent. But I'm afraid our time together must come to an end." Before Clarice could respond, Lecter turned and ran. The chase was on. Clarice and her team pursued him through the narrow streets and alleys, their footsteps echoing off the ancient walls. Lecter was fast and agile, but Clarice was driven by a determination that pushed her beyond her limits. The chase led them to the Boboli Gardens, a sprawling, labyrinthine park. Lecter darted through the gardens, using the twists and turns to his advantage. Clarice followed, her senses heightened, her focus unwavering. In a secluded corner of the garden, Lecter stopped and turned to face her. He held a knife, his eyes gleaming with a mix of excitement and menace. "This is where it ends, Clarice," he said softly. Clarice drew her weapon, her hand steady. "It's over, Lecter. There's nowhere left to run." Lecter smiled, a chilling, predatory smile. "You should know by now, Clarice, that I never run." With that, he lunged at her, the knife flashing in the moonlight. Clarice fired her weapon, the shot ringing out in the still night air. Lecter staggered, the knife slipping from his grasp. He fell to the ground, clutching his chest. Clarice approached cautiously, her gun still trained on him. "It's over," she said, her voice steady. "You're under arrest." Lecter looked up at her, a strange mix of admiration and regret in his eyes. "Well done, Clarice," he whispered. "Well done." Hannibal Lecter was finally in custody. The news spread quickly, and Clarice Starling was hailed as a hero once again. The international cooperation and relentless pursuit had paid off, bringing one of the most dangerous criminals in history to justice. Back at Quantico, the atmosphere was electric. Clarice was congratulated by her colleagues, and the media buzzed with stories of the dramatic chase through Florence. But for Clarice, the end of the hunt brought a mix of emotions. She felt relief, of course, but also a profound sense of exhaustion. The debriefings were thorough, covering every detail of the operation. Clarice recounted the chase, the confrontation in the Boboli Gardens, and Lecter's final words. She knew that the case would be studied for years to come, a textbook example of perseverance and collaboration. Despite the accolades, Clarice found it difficult to relax. The memories of the chase, the intense focus, and the face-off with Lecter replayed in her mind. She decided to take some time off, to once again find solace in the familiar surroundings of her family's farm in Montana. The peace and quiet of the farm provided a much-needed respite. Clarice spent her days walking through the fields, tending to the animals, and reconnecting with nature. She found comfort in the simplicity of farm life, a stark contrast to the chaos and danger of her work. As the days passed, Clarice began to feel a sense of healing. The nightmares became less frequent, and the weight of the hunt for Lecter started to lift. She knew that the journey had changed her, but she also knew that she had emerged stronger and more resilient. One evening, as she sat on the porch watching the sunset, Clarice received a call from Crawford. "How are you doing, Clarice?" he asked, his voice warm and concerned. "I'm doing better," she replied. "Taking some time to heal." "Good," Crawford said. "You deserve it. But when you're ready, we have new cases that need your expertise." Clarice smiled. "I'll be ready soon." "Thank you, Jack." As she ended the call, Clarice felt a renewed sense of purpose. The hunt for Hannibal Lecter had been a defining chapter in her life, but it was not the end. There were still people who needed her help, still crimes to solve, and justice to be served. After a few weeks of rest and reflection, Clarice returned to Quantico, ready to take on new challenges. She was greeted with warmth and respect by her colleagues, who recognized the sacrifices she had made and the strength she had shown. Clarice was assigned to a new task force, focusing on a series of high-profile kidnappings that had been plaguing the East Coast. The cases were complex and disturbing, involving young women who had disappeared without a trace. Clarice knew that this new mission would require all of her skills and experience. The task force was composed of some of the best agents in the FBI, and Clarice felt honored to be a part of it. They worked tirelessly, analyzing evidence, interviewing witnesses, and following leads. The investigation was challenging, but Clarice thrived under the pressure. She felt a renewed sense of purpose, driven by the desire to protect and serve. One evening, as the task force reviewed the latest developments, Clarice noticed a pattern in the abductions. The victims had all been taken from public places, but there was a common thread in their backgrounds. They were all connected to a particular online forum, a place where they had shared personal stories and experiences. Clarice dug deeper, uncovering a web of connections that led to a suspect, a man who had been using the forum to identify and target his victims. The team moved quickly, conducting surveillance and gathering evidence. They were determined to bring the perpetrator to justice before he could strike again. The operation culminated in a dramatic raid on the suspect's hideout. Clarice and her team moved in, apprehending the man and rescuing his latest victim. The sense of relief and accomplishment was palpable. They had saved a life and put an end to a reign of terror. As the task force celebrated their success, Clarice felt a deep sense of fulfillment. She knew that the work she did made a difference, that her efforts had a real impact on people's lives. The journey had been long and arduous, but it was moments like these that made it all worthwhile. Clarice's career continued to flourish, her reputation as a dedicated and skilled agent growing with each successful case. She took on new challenges, always pushing herself to be better, to do more. The experiences she had faced, the horrors, the triumphs, the lessons learned, had shaped her into a formidable force for justice. In her personal life, Clarice found a sense of balance. She maintained close relationships with her friends and family, finding joy and comfort in their support. She also made time for herself, pursuing hobbies and interests that brought her peace and happiness. One evening, as she sat in her office reflecting on her journey, Clarice received a call from Crawford. "Clarice, there's a new opportunity I'd like to discuss with you. It's a leadership position, heading up a new division focused on international cooperation in criminal investigations. I think you'd be perfect for it." Clarice felt a surge of excitement. The opportunity to lead a division, to work on a global scale, was a chance to make an even greater impact. She knew that the challenges would be significant, but she also knew that she was ready for them. "I'd be honored, Jack," she replied. "Thank you for believing in me." As she hung up the phone, Clarice felt a sense of anticipation. The future was full of possibilities, and she was ready to embrace them. She had faced the darkness and emerged stronger, ready to take on whatever challenges lay ahead. Clarice Starling's journey was far from over, but she knew that her experiences had prepared her for whatever lay ahead. She continued to serve with dedication and courage, always striving to make a difference. Her work had become more than just a job, it was a calling, a mission to protect and serve. As she led her new division, Clarice focused on building bridges between agencies, fostering collaboration, and sharing knowledge. She knew that the fight against crime required a united front, and she was committed to leading by example. Her legacy grew, inspiring new generations of agents who looked up to her as a mentor and a role model. Clarice took pride in helping others grow, in seeing them develop their skills and confidence. She knew that the future of law enforcement depended on the strength and dedication of those who followed in her footsteps. In her quiet moments, Clarice reflected on the journey that had brought her to this point. She thought about the challenges she had faced, the people she had met, and the lessons she had learned. She knew that the road ahead would not be easy, but she was ready to face it with the same determination and resilience that had carried her through so many trials. Clarice Starling's story was one of courage, perseverance, and hope. It was a story of facing the darkness and emerging stronger, of seeking justice and making a difference. As she looked to the future, she knew that her journey was far from over. There were still battles to be fought, still lives to be saved, and still justice to be served, and she was ready.